Hello, latest news update today. As you may remember, dealt a heavy blow to the invading Russian. Last week, the Russians had lost 31 battle tanks and dozens of soldiers in the city. Today, clashes in Voda have started to intensify again in order not to remain in a completely passive position in the city. After heavy tank losses, the Russians constantly took action with small attack groups to prevent the Ukrainians from taking over this area completely. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, completely seized the initiative in Vlada with their last successful offensive and carried out a huge counterattack today. And the Ukrainian forces pushed the Russian soldiers in Wada across the river and destroyed the Russians' 1-month effort here. The Russians, on the other hand, tried to attack again with their remaining troops in Wada against the counterattack operation carried out by the Ukrainians today. But these Russian attacks were no different from because the Russian army, which ended a period of serious decline in terms of morale and motivation, made great mistakes in the violent clashes that took place today. These major mistakes of the Russian forces caused the control of the city of Folyar to pass completely to the Ukrainian. In addition, as a result of the counterattack by the Ukrainians, hundreds of Russian soldiers died. The Russian forces who were seriously injured by the suicide attacks in VDA had to retreat. The Russians, who also lost the tactical bridgeheads in the eastern and western parts of the city, began to leave Vlada with their remaining troops. The troops on the border of Vlada started artillery fire for the Russian soldiers trying to escape from the city. The purpose of the Russians to launch this area fire was to evacuate the city completely safe, because the troops of the Ukrainian forces were spread in almost all parts of VDO. And this was very dangerous for the invading soldiers. While the Russian artillery fired continuously to protect their comrades who escaped from VDO, the Ukrainians continued to advance in pursuit of the fleeing invading troops. Aware of this danger, Russian artillery units also activated thermobaric artillery systems as an additional force. Due to these heavy area attacks, serious damage also occurred in the areas located on the borderlines and WDO. But as a result, after the counterattack operation organized by the Ukrainian armed forces and the intense efforts afterwards, the Russian forces were completely expelled from both the eastern and western borders of Fudo. In addition, against the Russian artillery located on the borderlines of Olyar, there was no response from the UK. The Ukrainian armed forces placed artillery brigades in the key areas of the city and in the range areas of the Russian artillery. This move for Ukraine yielded results in a much shorter time than expected because after the artillery duel between both sides of the war, photos were shared, showing that the TOS-1 thermobaric artillery system of the Russian army in Vlada was. The TOS-1 systems are highly vulnerable to battery firing. This is because the range of these systems is only 4 kilometers. In other words, the Russians need to get very close to Olyar in order to shoot with TOS-1 thermobaric system. For this reason, Russian artillery can become a completely open target for Ukrainian forces. The main reason why the effects of the Ukrainian artillery in this city was felt in a short time is actually due to this. On the other hand, part 2 of the plans of the Ukrainian forces in Modo was to carry out another counterattack and drive the Russians from the north bank of the river in Modo. The second part of the plan proceeded in an organized manner after the first counterattack by the Ukrainians. First of all, the Ukrainians sent the most experienced assault and artillery brigades in the army to this region. In this way, the Russian thermobaric and other artillery brigades were forced to flee out of the city and spread over wider. In addition, a tank unit of the Ukrainian army came to the clashes area to support the stunning operation. Ukraine came under heavy fire on the Russian artillery, brigades, and infantry units. In other words, the second part of the Ukrainian plans in Hoda was continuing very violently following the heavy clashes. The Russian forces were driven from the hills in the eastern part of F, and from all parts of the city. After these heavy losses, it was not possible for the Russian troops to regroup and attack Ludo. Therefore, as a result, the Ukrainian armed forces declared decisive victory. After all these successful attacks by the Ukrainians, an atmosphere of chaos and anxiety began to prevail in Russia. While the heavy losses of the Russian army were incessant, the continuous success of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield led to unrest in the Russian army. On the other hand, while the Ukrainian army continues to exhibit fierce resistance and counterattacks all over the battlefield, the Russian forces do not hesitate to break through in the Donbas despite all these losses. In fact, the biggest problem for the Russians stems entirely from this. Despite heavy losses, the Russian army continues attacking, especially under the command of Vladimir Putin, in order not to show its weakness. But for this cause, the Russian army has to lose a record number of soldiers. Therefore, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is constantly sending reinforcement military support groups to the Ukrainian front lines. According to Rob Bauer, chairman of the NATO Military Committee and Admiral of the Royal Netherlands, the Russian military has now deployed more than 90% of all ground forces in Ukraine. This means that the Kremlin has almost no reserves to draw on. and is dependent on methods of building more forces to increase its size and fill the gaps created by war. Also, the Russian Ministry of Defense has not been very efficient in recruiting, training, and deploying new. Overall, Ukraine's Ministry of Defense claimed last day that Ukrainian forces have killed about 142,860 Russian soldiers and wounded about 2 to 3 times that number. The fact that the Russians suffered so many heavy losses inevitably brings the Ukrainians much closer to victory, especially a few days before the anniversary of the war. It is inevitable that the situation will be reflected on the front lines. For this reason, the Ukrainian forces should take advantage of the unfavorable situation of the Russian army because Ukrainians and the whole world know that Russian leader of Vladimir Putin will not give up on his plans, even though his army suffered a record number of casualties. The Ukrainian army should not be deceived by the heavy losses of the Russians and take all precautions in this regard. The military aid plan to be sent to the Ukrainian army is of vital importance. Regarding the planned military aid to the Ukrainian army, critical information shook the agenda. This week, the Ukrainian military announced that it will receive the first batch of MX-10RC tank killers from France. The France defense minister has announced that the first 14 MX-10RC wheeled tank destroyers will arrive in Ukraine this weekend. A 6x6 wheeled vehicle with a 105mm medium-pressure gun. The AMMX-10RC combines the lethality of a tank with the mobility of an off-road vehicle. The French tank destroyer has a crew of 4 and can weigh up to 22 tons, depending on its configuration. When it comes to armor, the AMMX-10RC doesn't have the heaviest one, but it depends on mobility to survive on the modern battlefield. For this reason, it is expected that the losses of the Russians will be much heavier with the participation of these war beasts in the Ukrainian army. We will see together what kind of contribution France's tank, which has planned to be provided in such a critical period, will make to Ukraine's progress this week. And next update, the word is pass abroad. In the one-year anniversary of fresher SLU-scale invasion of Ukraine, the front line may be frozen, but the war rages only in Ukraine. So far, the conflict has produced many military, diplomatic, and strategic surprises. On the one hand, Moscow was taught by the combats of the Ukrainian forces and by the EU and US support for the Kiev army, which received substantial support from many Western countries, especially in NATO, beat the Russian invading troops on the front lines, so to speak, with the determined stance of the Kiev army. The Russian troops on the Ukrainian fronts were repelled at many points. Moscow military units, which have been reports from many points, have made small gains in recent months and are trying to make a breakthrough on the eastern front line, especially in a town that Moscow sees as the key to taking control over the entire eastern Donbass region. The military stockpile has demanded rapidly. In recent weeks, hundreds of soldiers were killed and wounded every day in BMA to Russia. Military is paying a very high price for its small advances. Although the casualty rate in the Ukrainian war slowed down in the first days of the week, the highs are increasing. In the last 48 hours alone, Russian forces have lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, so Russian forces will have an increasingly difficult job of achieving an operational breakthrough as the days go by. Despite the casualty, the Russian army and mercenary groups who want to gain gains on the front continue to struggle. Russia's paramilitary Wagner group said it had captured another village outside of Bama as Moscow forces continued their months-long assault on the eastern Ukrainian city. Later in the announcement, the Wagner-affiliated Telegram channel Grey Zone released a video allegedly showing the band members in the village. 4 months Wagner warriors led the attack on Bama. Although they were unsuccessful in capturing the city and inflicted hollows, they gradually captured one town after another on the outskirts of Bama, and the waste in and out of the Ukrainian forces became increasingly scarce. Wagner's latest claim to success comes amid heightened tensions with the Russian Ministry of Defense, which the paramilitary group said was unable to supply it with new ammunition. Ukraine responded to the aggressive actions of the Wagner group against Bakhmut with a counter-move. Members of the Special Operation Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine shared a video showing the liquidation of 7 rationing waiters nearby. During the reconnaissance MB environment direction, Special Operation Forces soldiers noticed the movement of the Russian waiters and successfully followed them. As a result, at least some Russian waiters were killed, including a machine gun, a radio operator, an observer with 8 vision device, and an assault team. The Russian troops suffering closes with. In addition to BMU, the Russian occupying troops in the Donetsk region are exhibiting their aggressive movement. It's clear that the threat of Russian missile attack continues in Ukraine. Russian Federation troops carried out 16 missile attacks mainly on the civilian infrastructure of the city of Kamel-Netsky in the Donetsk region and the settlement of Ukrainians. As a result of the missile attacks, residential buildings were damaged. Civilian casualties were reported. Russian invading troops also carried out 4S strikes and more than 30 MLRS strikes during the day. A harsh response from the Ukrainian armed forces to the aggressive behavior of the Moscow forces came without delay. During the day, the Ukrainian Air Force conducts 4 attacks on Russian occupying personnel and clusters of military equipment. 2 Caliber cruise missiles were destroyed at the same time. The Mess Island artillery units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces to truck a Russian manpower in another development aircraft of the Ukrainian Defense Forces launched to welfare attacks on Russian military personnel and equipment collection areas, and 2 attacks on the positions of the enemy's entire aircraft missile systems. Ukrainian Missile Island artillery units destroyed 2 troop concentration areas and ammunition to port the location of an entire aircraft missile system, and 2 more important Russian and Waitan objects. Also, the other day, Russia launched Caliber cruise missiles from the Black Sea to Ukrainian territory. Ukraine's air defense shut down 2 of the 4 Russian missiles. Among other cruise and ballistic styles, Calibers became the main weapons used by Russia to attack Ukraine civilian infrastructure. In addition, Ukrainian intelligence claimed that Russia's stocks were about to run out. Ukrainian intelligence said that it could still continue to produce 20 Calibers per month. Russia bragged in December that these missile signs would never run. As a result of Russia's missile stock claims, winning the war for the Ukrainian skies is as important as winning the war on land. Despite recent moves by NATO allies such as the United States and Germany to end previous objections to provide and heavy armor to Ukraine, they remain hesitant to do the same for aircraft. Time is passing. Ukraine needs warplanes soon. Best concerns about handing over fighter, such as the F-16 to Ukraine, seem to be rooted in political considerations rather than military strategy. Fearful-like offices can recommend the face approach that Western and political leaders have taken as a strategy for winning the Ukrainian war. The alternative is often a brutal war of attrition. Aerial footage from modern battlefield in Ukraine evokes the photographical wounds and trenches of the Western Front of World War II. A battle fit drenched too. The West's promises of a main battle tend to Ukraine are perhaps the end of the World War II, a war that left 8 million dead in the West alone. It could clear the swamp of the trench warfare similar to World War II. This war also revealed the advantage of air currently in Ukraine. Pilots on both sides routinely fly at low altitude to avoid anti-aircraft guns, but precision-guided munition like JDAM, or laser-guided bombs of the kind that devastated Ura in Serbia, are designed for medium altitude or higher firing. Trying to use these weapons at a low level is a waste. The simple point is that Ukraine must gain and maintain air superiority in order to operate in the medium-high altitude regime. Once accomplished, the war will quickly turn in Ukraine's. This should be an important priority for Western leaders who want to avoid an endless war in Europe. Ukraine will need a reasonable number of air-grant-capable fighter jets and sustained GM-88 high-speed and tire radiation missiles. Reclaiming the Russian air defense is the first piece of the puzzle. Once achieved, the game changes. Ukrainian pilots will then be able to deliver medium-altitude precision weapons to Russian ground forces and strategic targets at any time. But precision heating is only an advantage. Air superiority increases the freedom of movement of friendly forces while limiting it to the enemy. Ukrainian ground forces commanders can maximize the effects of the heavy tanks and inventory fighting vehicles. Air superiority opens the battlefield for the side that has it and narrows it for the other. The Grand War, which continues at the current air parity level, is more difficult and costly in terms of both monetary and human life. All the Western leaders are not active fighters in the Ukrainian war. They openly distribute their tools in a micromanagement style using a piecemeal-supported branch to Kiev. The supplier of 4 planes to Ukraine would ensure a faster and more decisive victory for this embattled country, minimizing the cost and losses of a long. It also requires courageous leaders to make tough decisions. Some Pentagon officials seem to be increasingly advocating this approach, given the reticence of leaders in Washington about rethinking their policies regarding aircraft. It's hard to see how careful they listen to military advice. Some members of Congress advocate sending F-16s too. These voices should be raised and escalated to hesitant coalition partners in case of overwhelming force from a combined air and ground operation. If the U.S. and its allies want to end this war with limited loss of life, they should know that the solution lies in Ukrainian airspace.